Welcome to another special edition of Daily Dose, and very excited to be back in the very famous Pandect Bible, which means it includes both the Old Testament and the New Testament, known as Codex Alexandrinus. This is dated to the sort of middle of the 400s or thereabouts. And in the prior video, I introduced the history of the Codex, took a look at its table of contents, and in today's video, we're going to get into some of the interesting scribal features and some of the other kind of fascinating little quirks of at least the Old Testament side of this manuscript. And just to remind you that a lot of times a seasoned textual critic will be able to spot this codex a mile away because of its large letters that are extended into the margins through both ekthesis as well as letter enlargement. You'll see the fees are often quite prominent. The rows, actually, I don't think I mentioned this last time, they are very prominent as well because the descending line goes way down. It's quite prominent. There's paragraph numbering or other types of features in the margins. You'll see there's some spaces and end lines and that kind of stuff. So those are the kinds of things that often tip people off that we are dealing with Codex Alexandrinus. So just to remind you of some of the paleographical stuff in the marginalia. Now, before we get into some specific examples, just want to jump around very briefly just to show you that the scribe or later correctors to the manuscript were fairly active, although I would argue that at least on the Old Testament side of the equation, this particular manuscript is not quite as worked over as we saw perhaps with Codex Vaticanus, or certainly not as edited as Codex Sinaiticus. There's just, generally speaking, not as much scribal corrections and so forth on the page, at least on the Old Testament side of things. And this is a good example where here you have a letter inserted above the line, a beta there, an alpha here, a fairly prominent marginal annotation trying to make a correction there. And so you do see these kinds of features on occasion in Codex Alexandrinus, or here's another example where you have yet again another scribal addition in the margin, as well as apparently a piece of tape. But let's now drill in on one particular example. We're going to be taking a look at Genesis 5, verses 25 through 27. This is part of the genealogies in Genesis 5. We didn't cover these verses previously when we went through this section of Genesis, so this will be a good chance to take a look at those as well and get some reading in from Codex Alexandrinus. Let's begin here in verse 25. So we have a chi here. You see the enlarged kappa. Then we have Ezasin, so you see that's a nice zeta, eta, lunate sigma there, en. And then we have Methuselah. So Methuselah lived. And then we have a first number here, and this is hecaton. Now you may be wondering, where's the n? Well, it's not out at the end. It's theoretically a new bar, but it looks a little bit erased there. That would be 100. So hecaton, and I can show that now on the screen. So okay, Ezasin, Methuselah, hecaton. So he lived 100, but we're not done yet. If you look it up in Rolf's Honhart and the Göttingen edition, you'll see it's kai hexaconta hepta ete, and that is 67 years. But if you look at Alexandrinus, you do see the chi, and then you see something going on right here, and then a conta, and then a hepta, so that's fine, and then ete. So what's going on there? Well, a corrector has come in and erased at least the first part of hexaconta and written agdoeconta. They've replaced 60 with 80, and so you can see they tried to smudge it in there. And so that's going to be the corrector to Alexandrinus. As you can see, we would list that with the C there. And in case you're wondering, that is precisely what we see when we take a look at the apparatus of the Göttingen edition, which looks something like this. You'll have the original scribe of Alexandrinus, they believe, had the 60 hexaconta, but the corrector has the 80 there, agdoeconta. And then it finishes with K egenesenton lemeki begat Lamech. Now let's move on to verse 26. We have another chi here. Notice it's not as prominent a letter enlargement via the ekthesis, but you do see it jutted out into the margin nevertheless. So chi, and then we have once again Ezasin. You see that nice little decorative, or not quite decorative, but the zeta there has little tails and so forth. That's kind of fun. And then we have Methuselah again. And then we have meta plus ta. So let's throw that up on the screen here. So metata, so this is probably going to be followed by an infinitive. It would be after, but let's take a look. So we have a genesi, so there we go, genesi there, your aorist active infinitive. Auton here, you see the alpha upsilon ton, and so that's going to be the infinitive pseudo-subject, so after he begat, if you will. And then we have ton, and then they tried to squeeze it in a little bit, so we got Lamech there, and then we got something going on in the margin, so that's what we need to spend some time taking a look at. Now, again, the Ross text has octacosia, which is 800, and then duo, ete, so 802 years. And I'm going to explain why I don't finish it out there. Now, if you were to look things up in Göttingen, and I've shown you the Ross Henhart text, they actually move this ete up here after Lamech. That doesn't change the meaning. It's the same number of 802. But what's going on with this stuff in the margin and whatever this is, plus very clearly something has been erased and replaced right there. Again, with this facsimile, it's a little bit difficult to make it all out. So what's happening there? We'll come back to that in a second. Let's finish the sentence, though. We have the egenason. We'll come back to the numbers here. Huioi sons, ke thugateros, and daughters. Now, let's drill into this textual variant. And this is what it looks like. What the scribe has done is replaced 802 with heptacosia. So that's what that is. They didn't even finish it, so they basically just wrote heptach. And then this, actually, we saw this a long time ago. This is a ligature for chi. It's basically a K with a little tail on it. And then you can see, although it's a little bit smudged, the Agdoe Kanta there. So 682 is what they have modified it towards, and that's what you'll see in Codex Alexandrinus. And so let me show you how this looks as well. In the Göttingen edition, you'll see it's the Heptacosia K Agdoe Kanta Duo Ete in Alexandrinus corrector there, as opposed to the original scribe, which is really hard to make out what the original scribe wrote because it's so thoroughly erased. Now, that's actually kind of a good thing to pause on. If you look at numbers of years in the Genesis genealogies, especially chapter 5, but you see it elsewhere, they're often kind of all over the place in terms of the number of years anyone lives. And in fact, I actually got an email from a pastor friend of mine just a couple days ago asking me what the deal is between the Masoretic text for a certain age in the book of Genesis and what he looked up, and it was good for him. He looked it up in the Septuagint. He's like, wait, those numbers are different. And he said, why is that? I said, I have no idea. That's kind of a thing in the Septuagint, that there's a lot of noise when it comes to the numbers. And not only is there a lot of noise when you compare the Masoretic text with what we have in the Old Greek, there's a lot of noise when you even look at the manuscripts of the Old Greek, such as Alexandrinus here, where the numbers tend to move around, which makes computing things and trying to figure out how long anyone's living relative to someone else. It makes it quite difficult to pin down because there apparently was a lot of turbulence, if you will, in the scribal tradition. So that's Genesis 5:26. Now let's take a look at one more verse, looking at Genesis 5:27. And so we'll start once again with our chi here with the ekthesis in the margin. And then we have egenanta. And then pasai hi hemerai there. So you see the lunate sigma of pas, but it's the nominative plural feminine, and then you have the article hi plus hemerai there. Of course, you don't have many accent markings and so forth at this stage in this particular manuscript. Let me throw it up on the screen there. So egenanta pasai hemerai. So all of the days were something like that. And then we have Methusa. And then we have a relative pronoun, as or alpha sigma, has, and then we have azason. You can sort of see there's a little bit of bleed through from the other side of the parchment, but that's your epsilon plus a zeta plus an eta, and so on. Wait a second. Methus doesn't sound like the correct name. That's not how he's been spelled thus far. And then you'll see that, wait a second, the scribe has added an LA above the line. My guess is, and this is what it looks like then, my guess is because of the SA and the AS, they somehow, their eyes skipped over the LA through some sort of haplography there because the letter formations look similar. And so they added it back. They caught themselves. And in this case, we actually have a fairly stable tradition, at least with Alexandrinus, for the remaining numbers. So we have Enocosia here, and then Chi, Exekanta, Enea, Ete. So that's going to be 969 years. And then we have a Chi, And then we have finally the Apathanen, which is he died. So all of his days were very, very old. Of course, Methuselah being the oldest one mentioned in the Genesis genealogy. And then what's nice here is, and you'll see this often in the genealogy, you have a nice enlarged space here prior to the start of the next cycle of the genealogy. And even though you have the chi right here, which technically begins the next verse, when you get to the next line, they still do an ecthesis, so that draws your eye to the fact that, okay, we've started a new section here, even though technically it began halfway through the prior line. They do the ecthesis at the next available moment to draw your attention to it. So that's Genesis 5, 25 through 27. If we scroll down just briefly to point something out, if you look at verses 28 and 29, you will see some nomina sacra there. And so this would be kurios, the first letter, plus the final sigma, your article here, and then theta plus your sigma, both having the line over them. Of course, the scribe of Codex Alexandrinus, or the multiple scribes, were Christians, and so we would expect to see the divine names abbreviated in that way. Just a good to point that out. Here's what they look like on the screen. Few final things to mention as I was just kind of flipping through Genesis, and notice some of the pages have some damage and seem to have some repair work done, so that's kind of neat. Some little scribal stuff added in there. Once you get to Genesis 36, you have a list of essentially generals or commanders of the various tribes and so forth. Not tribes, but of the various groups of people. And I found it interesting. I hadn't seen this before, that they actually shifted to, the scribe shifted to a table format, which, if anyone knows me, I love tables and organizing things visually. So you'll notice you have the hegemon here in a separate column, and Loton and Sobal and so forth. So they got the name of the person here. And hegemon does the same thing over here with the nice tabular format. Right in the middle of the column, they break it into two columns. So that's pretty fun. That it's like they sort of inserted a table in Microsoft Word to make it look pretty. You see some of that kind of stuff in some New Testament manuscripts as well, but I hadn't actually noticed it in Alexandrinus for this section. So that's pretty cool, in my opinion. If you get to the end of Genesis, and I showed you an example of this last time in the prior video from one of the Gospels, but at the end of Genesis, you have a decorative coronis here, plus genesis, cosmu, the beginning or origins of the world, and each letter has a nice little decoration on it. So the scribe was feeling precious there, making things look nice. And then at the start of the next book, of course, Exodus, you'll see Exodus Aiguptu here with some decorations as well, with a nice big massive towel there and so on. So pretty fun to see the end of the book as well. They took very seriously the transition from one to the other and tried to make it very nice and pristine and polished. This is a high quality manuscript. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed getting our feet wet in Alexandrinus, taking a look at some of the scribal behaviors, and stay tuned for more as we continue making our way through bits and pieces of this famous Bible manuscript. So hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for tuning in.